Hey everybody, and welcome back to my channel, where today we are going to be doing a full-length, mostly non-spoilery review of the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turton. So this is an adult murder mystery with like a speculative fiction kind of element to it, and I am going to go ahead and just read the description from the back of the book. It says, Evelyn Hardcastle will die every day until Aidan Bishop can identify her killer and break the cycle. But every time the day begins again, Aidan wakes up in the body of a different guest, and some of his hosts are more helpful than others. So I did say mostly spoiler free. When I do get to the spoilery sections, don't worry, there will be big warnings with a timestamp of where you can jump ahead to, so that hopefully you will not be accidentally spoiled for this particular book. Now, first thing I must say is that there are a ton of content warnings for this particular book. It is a murder mystery. It is also a bit of a thriller, and there's a lot going on with that in particular. Link down below to Storygraph should help you get started with those content warnings if you need them. So for the format of this particular review, we are going to be doing 3 pros and 3 cons, and we will start with the first pro, and that is that this is an incredibly atmospheric book. I was just so impressed with this. And it wasn't just the setting. The setting was great. Blackheath as the manor was amazing with the grounds added in. It just really was perfect. It really set the stage of this oppressive, hopeless, almost inevitable kind of feeling to it. But it wasn't just the setting that really added to this atmosphere, it was also the characters and the plot itself. And I honestly think that how those 3 things, the setting, the plot, and the characters, ended up interacting to create this atmosphere was just incredibly well done. So our first con is actually not so much a con, well, it was a con for me, but it is much more of an FYI, and that is that this book does take more focus. Now, for some of you who routinely read things like Game of Thrones and Stormlight Archive, like this may not be a big deal, but for somebody like me who does not tend to read super detailed things that requires you to hold on to those details, it was a little bit more difficult. Now, I knew it was going to take more focus than the regular book. I wasn't completely oblivious, but what I didn't count on was the fact that there was going to be some details that were from like the first day or the second day or the third day that we needed on the last day, and I didn't quite remember all of it. And the author does not fully hold your hand. It'll be like, hey, remember that event that took place? But the author doesn't give you all the details around that event. So it's kind of like that half hand holding. And so unfortunately for me personally, not realizing that I needed to pay very close attention to all these details, I did actually start another book, which kind of like made it much more difficult for me to remember all the details. And so I ended up confused at certain points, and I ended up having to go back and look, which was just kind of it broke the flow of reading a little bit more than I liked. So I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned that this does take a lot more focus. So if you are more like me, who can focus, but just needs to work at it, just know that going in, that you may need to actually do a little bit more work for this book. The second pro that I want to talk about is that I found it absolutely fascinating to watch the characters and their development, specifically the NPC kind of characters. So not Aidan's host bodies, but like the other house guests, right? Because the thing is, Aidan is in 8 different hosts, and they have different relationships. Each of those hosts have different relationships, even with the same person. And so you get to see different facets of the same person. And I found it not only fascinating, but I found that it really added to this idea that these are real people. Because the reality is, we're not always like, mustache twirling evil, or always the white knight in shining armor. There's a lot of shades of gray and differing shades of gray, and it made it feel much more real. It made it a lot more interesting to watch these characters, especially as some of them we interact with basically every single day. And so I just found, even though I didn't like any of these characters, I just found it utterly fascinating. Now, let's talk about con number two, which is actually the first real con. And that is that one of Aiden's hosts, his fourth host specifically, is Lord Ravencroft. And Lord Ravencroft is both fat and has mobility issues. And I don't think that the author handled it all that well. So the thing is, when Aiden first woke up in this particular body, he noted that he had mobility issues. And he started freaking out immediately because how is that going to affect his murder investigation, right? Which I didn't 100% love, but that was fairly understandable. Aiden has very practical reasons for needing to be able to easily move around the house. But then he finds out that his body is fat, and he was still mostly focused on like the more practical side of things, but was also a little bit kind of grossed out. And I was like, I'm not as okay with this. Like it doesn't it doesn't feel great. And then he went to bathe, and he saw his host's naked body in the mirror, and he sobbed. And it was just the one, it was over very quickly. But with that, the author introduced shame into the mix. And with shame is a commentary on that fat body. And I did not appreciate that we added that commentary in. So, like, I understood, again, like I said before, it was just more practicality. How am I going to move around the house to do this investigation with somebody who struggles to move around? But adding shame into the mix and adding that commentary just felt kind of gross to me. And it really kind of tainted every single other thing that Aiden had to say about this particular host body. Even when it was much more a factual kind of thing, it just still didn't feel very good because it just ended up tainted. And so I did read the Q&A from the author at the end where he kind of talks about Lord Ravencroft. Didn't make me feel any better. None of it is challenged in text, by the way, about like his feelings about the fat body. It's not challenged, and honestly, other people very clearly, like other characters very clearly have feelings about the fact that Lord Ravencroft is fat. It's just not good. And so kind of where I ended up in my feelings with this is that I think that Aiden had a very realistic response to as a person who's probably like skinny or average size suddenly finding themselves in a fat body, especially a fat body with mobility issues. I think that his reaction was very realistic, but realistic does not mean kind, and it doesn't mean pleasant to read. And with that added commentary and shame, I just don't think that it was handled very well. So that leaves us with the third positive. And of course, like one of the big questions about a murder mystery is, but what was the murder mystery good? And honestly, the murder mystery plot was so good. It was so it was intricate, and it was layered, and it was really interesting. Like you get dumped into the story at the very beginning, and it kind of unfolds in its own time. You have no idea where it's going. And like it wasn't even till the halfway point that I kind of saw the outline of a possibility of a place where we might be going. But like honestly, like I was still guessing up until the end. Now, keep in mind, I don't read a ton of murder mysteries, so it's really difficult for me to guess, but I had no idea. And the thing is that I really did appreciate is that even as we were getting new clues and new information was kind of slotting into place, it made sense. There was nothing that really jumped out at me and said, like, No, that doesn't hold up. So everything was just very well done. The clues that were left behind in the beginning, so it felt much more real. It was just well done. It was very well done. Now that being said, our last con, um, while the murder mystery plot was great and the ending of that was awesome, I think there were, as with most things, there were some subplots, and I don't think that the ending of one of those subplots was done very well. It felt like the author really wanted to say something, make a moral point, let's say, and I think that the point that was made was incredibly reductionist, that it took this very complex issue that has a lot of facets to consider and pulled out one point and said, problem solved. And I just did not appreciate that. I just did not like it. It was one of those things where it absolutely hindered my enjoyment of the ending. I felt like the author just did not stick the landing, which is really, really unfortunate. So this is the part where we are going to talk spoilers. I want to talk a little bit more about that ending, specifically what I had issues with. So timestamp here, so you can go ahead and jump to this point in time, and then I won't be talking about spoilers anymore. So here's the thing. I feel like this book had a lot of kind of conflicting things to say about the justice system, but a lot of it was never outright said. And so here's the thing. Here's where I start. One of them is this idea of whether a prison should be about a punishment for the criminal or a rehabilitation of the criminal. And the thing is, if you want a punishment, that's like, if you truly believe that crime should be punished, that's fine. That's your opinion. But how you go about punishing people is going to be different than how you go about rehabilitating people. And so you can't really make a system that does both at the same time. But this system, like, so when we find out that, like, Blackheath is a prison, the plague doctor kind of leads us to believe that this is a punishment. Not Evelyn Hardcastle, Annabelle has been given this task to basically solve an impossible riddle, and in this completely gloomy, awful place. And so it feels much more like this is a punishment that she's never intended to kind of finish. But like, Aiden makes the point that it's really difficult to rehabilitate a person in a place that is as awful as Blackheath is, which is a valid point. But it misses this idea of, was this ever intended to be a rehabilitation or not? And then it kind of feels like, Annabelle was let go because she was rehabilitated, but then we're back to, okay, if the intention was always to be rehabilitation, then why was she given this impossible riddle to solve? And why was she put in a place that was never going to facilitate her rehabilitation? Like, none of that really makes sense. And then part of the other thing was that kind of comes up when we're talking justice system is whether or not the victims of the crimes have a right to what they feel is justice, right? Like, do they get a say in the punishment, or not? And again, in this case, we had both instances, because Aiden Bishop is not a victim, but a family of the victim, and he came to Blackheath to seek vengeance against Annabelle. And so that says that this system is okay with some amount of engagement from the victims or the victim's family, and ensuring that they feel that justice has been done, that they do get a say in the punishment. But then the plague doctor allows Annabelle to leave after she's, solved the murder and been rehabilitated and everything. And he does this without asking any of the other victims, families, about how they feel about the situation and whether they feel justice has been done or not. So then you're just like, okay, so you've got both things happening here too. Now, obviously, in this instance, like the prison system is different than the one warden, but at the same time, it's conflicting things. And then it never, and by the way, like both of these things, whether it's punishment versus rehabilitation or whether the victims should be involved in the punishment, like this isn't even talked about in the ending either, which was incredibly frustrating. But the other thing that it completely ignored is, are there any crimes that are so heinous, so large, that that the person that committed them should never be allowed to leave, rehabilitated or no? And it does, to some extent, go into this idea of whether this is punishment or whether it's rehabilitation. But it kind of, the text kind of dances around this topic because the plague doctor does say, like, you're going to have to keep your head low and keep moving because so many people are going to be unhappy with knowing that Annabelle is out. And so it's just like, okay, again, like, I think that it's worth noting that for a lot of us, we do feel that there are some crimes that you can never really be rehabilitated from, or that regardless of how much you change as a person, you just made too big of a mistake. And it just never addressed that. It never asked that question. And so I feel what it ended up feeling like to me is that all of that conversation was completely ignored to basically be like, everybody can be rehabilitated, and if they are, then the punishment is done. And I think that just ignores too much of this conversation. And so it felt kind of like, honestly, that it would have been a stronger book without that part of this in here. And it really, that just makes the ending so much weaker. So there you go. Those are all my thoughts and feelings about this book. If you have read it, please leave your thoughts and feelings down below. If you would like to talk spoilers, please just hit enter a bunch of times so that you end up with a line break so that we're not accidentally spoiling others. But I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions, or if you have any thoughts about my feelings. Again, be aware of spoilers and hiding them from anybody who doesn't want to see them. But that's all I have for this particular video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. And until next time, have happy reading, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!